How did the Lord use the problems Samson created in order to accomplish his purpose? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Judges 15, verses 14 to 20, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Judges chapter 15, verse 14, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges chapter 15, beginning at verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I have slain 1,000 men." And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and called that place Ramath-Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called the name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. The events in chapter 15 can all be traced back to the beginning of chapter 14 and the wedding of Samson. Recall that Samson wanted to marry a Philistine against the wishes of his parents. God allowed Samson to marry the Philistine because his purpose would be accomplished through that marriage in executing judgment on the Philistines for their sin. And since God is the lawgiver and definer of sin, we cannot charge Samson with sin in getting married to this woman in the first place. However, at the wedding, Samson told a riddle, thinking that the riddle was unsolvable, which would result in him receiving 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing from the men he told the riddle to. These Philistine men, though, threatened Samson's wife and family with death if she didn't tell them the answer, which she ultimately did once she found out that answer from Samson himself. As a result, Samson had to pay up, and so, in conjunction with bringing God's judgment against the Philistines, Samson took off some of the clothing of the men he slew and settled his debts with them. Angry, however, at his wife, Samson left for home, leaving her behind. This decision set in motion the events of chapter 15. Samson's father-in-law, because he thought Samson had abandoned his daughter, gave his daughter off in marriage to what would have been Samson's best man at the wedding. The problem was, Samson hadn't intended to abandon her, and when he came later to see her, only then learned of what had happened. This resulted in Samson burning down a field of grain owned by the Philistines, again with God's judgment upon the Philistines serving a dual purpose for Samson. And that in turn caused the Philistines to burn Samson's father-in-law and his daughter with fire as punishment, which in turn caused Samson to kill many of them with a great slaughter, which in turn caused the Philistines to gather against Judah, demanding Samson's arrest. It was with that arrest where we ended our last lesson and begin discussing verses 14 and onwards. Before getting there, though, you might ask, why did Samson allow the men of Judah to arrest him and deliver him to the Philistines? I believe this shows us Samson, though he was a flawed man, had faith that God would deliver him. God delivered him from the lion, and he delivered him from the men of Ashkelon. God had delivered Samson by providing him the physical strength needed to overcome. In this, Samson understood God's purpose for him in this regard, and was confident that God would see him through this too. Coming out of verse 14, notice here that the men of Judah had bound Samson with 2 new ropes. That meant that these ropes were strong. They weren't frayed, they weren't cut, and they weren't lax because of use. Since Samson was known for his strength, these ropes, one would have thought, would have held Samson. But of course they didn't, for when the Philistines came to fetch him, the Spirit of the Lord again came upon Samson, providing him the strength needed to break the ropes. But the strength to break the ropes was one thing. The Philistines were still a threat. Would Samson run away and hide? No, for the Spirit of the Lord also gave him the strength to fight. However, this battle wouldn't be waged by Samson with a sword, a spear, or arrows. It would be waged with the jawbone of a donkey. By using this as his instrument of war, there could be no doubt in anyone's mind as to who was responsible for the victory, that being God, of course. For nobody could defeat as many as Samson did simply by wielding the jawbone of a donkey. It is said that Samson had slain 1,000 men that day, with that number likely being rounded off to represent a large contingent of men. But even though Samson was delivered by the power of God, didn't mean that Samson became a superhero and expended no energy. For after the battle, Samson thirsted. Remember, it's the wheat harvest, mid-May, early June at this point. So it's likely hot outside too, compounding Samson's thirst. Samson cried out to the Lord who delivered Israel that day through his hand to provide him with water so that he didn't fall into the hands of the Philistines. And the Lord did provide that water, and he did so miraculously by splitting open a rock in Lehi to do so. Samson called the name of the rock where the water came out in Hakor, which means spring of the caller. A fitting name indeed. Now that we've looked at the entire 2 chapters that surround this story of Samson, I'd like us to consider all that has happened and the root causes of it. Back in chapter 14, we said that Samson marrying the Philistine woman was allowed by the Lord because it would help accomplish the Lord's purpose. And yet, when we read the entire story, we find that what resulted from this marriage only brought Samson grief, torment, and conflict. The question then comes, couldn't the Lord have delivered Israel from the Philistines without having Samson have to endure so much pain? But in asking that question, we're assuming that it was the Lord's purpose to deliver Israel through the pain and suffering of Samson, something that I don't believe the text teaches. Yes, the Lord allowed Samson to marry the Philistine, but was that the root cause of the problem? No, for it started with the arrogance of Samson in telling that riddle in order to obtain earthly goods. Had Samson simply got married to this woman without doing this, Samson could have delivered Israel, but avoided all of this suffering. Think about it. Why was he angry with his wife? Because she betrayed his trust in telling the Philistine men the answer to the riddle. If there was no answer to tell, Samson wouldn't have got angry with his wife. She, in turn, wouldn't have been married off to another man, thus causing the escalation which resulted in Samson's wife's death and his later capture. To say that God always planned it this way is reading into the story something that is not there, and I personally believe is not fully understanding the all-knowing nature of God. Just because something happens doesn't mean that God caused it to happen, nor does it mean that what happened was inevitable and unchangeable. Man has free will, and that included Samson. Yes, God's will was accomplished in spite of Samson's choices, which is the point. God's will be done, no matter what we choose. How it will be done, though, can be affected by our choices. Had Samson made some better choices, then God's will could have been accomplished some other way, a way that would have likely led Samson to living a more happy life. But Samson, like all of us, wasn't a perfect man. He suffered from earthly weaknesses and temptations, which caused him to make some poor choices. And he suffered the consequences for those choices. But God's will in punishing the Philistines for sin was going to be done no matter what. So God used those choices to bring about deliverance for Israel. However, it was a deliverance that would come at a high personal cost for Samson, in spite of his success. Chapter 15 tells us that Samson judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. This phrasing again shows us that the land of Israel didn't enjoy rest during Samson's judgeship, but rather that Samson continued battling the Philistines until the end of his life, events for which we'll begin to cover, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Judges chapter 16, verses 1 to 9, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.